Alright, this is the one that changes everything, and I need every single person watching this to put down whatever you are doing, mute the group chats, and pay attention because what I am about to walk you through is not a rumor. It is not a TikTok screenshot. It is a sworn court filing that just landed on a federal docket, signed under penalty of perjury, which means the man who put his signature on that document either told the truth or he voluntarily walked himself into a federal prison cell. So when I tell you that what Christopher Blake Griffith just delivered to a judge in his legal war against Stefon Diggs is the most catastrophic single filing to hit any NFL-related case in years, I am not throwing gasoline on this for engagement. I am telling you that a man just swore on the record that he is holding Stefon Diggs' own text messages, Stefon Diggs' own phone logs, and Stefon Diggs' own travel records produced through court-ordered discovery. And those documents, according to this sworn filing, do not suggest. They do not imply. They demonstrate the coordination of a violent assault that Christopher Blake Griffith says left him beaten, robbed, and terrorized. This is not a hot take. This is a demolition order. And Stefon Diggs is the structure standing directly beneath the wrecking ball. Hit that like button if you want more content like this, subscribe if you have not already, and let me get straight into it because this story does not wait for anybody. Now, here is the distinction that matters more than anything else I will say in this entire video. The difference between what happens on Instagram and what happens inside a courthouse. On Instagram, Stefon Diggs can post a caption, delete it, blame a hacker, laugh it off, and keep scrolling. Inside a courthouse, when you sign a document under penalty of perjury and it turns out to be even slightly untrue, you have just handed the federal government a key to your front door. So the fact that Christopher Blake Griffith has now sworn on the record that he is in possession of text messages, phone logs, flight itineraries, and coordination records that came directly out of Stefon Diggs' own document production should be raising every hair on your forearm. Because Stefon Diggs, the same man who fought discovery like it was a press corner in the red zone. The same man whose attorneys tried to downplay his relationship with Christopher Blake Griffith in interrogatories as if they were casual acquaintances. The same man whose legal team has been sweating through their dress shirts for months has now, by order of the court, been forced to hand over the exact paper trail that may end up burying him. That is not a headline. That is a career obituary being typed in real time. Let me set the table for anybody just clicking in, because I know a good portion of you showed up because the thumbnail had a certain name attached to it, and we will absolutely get to her in a minute because her fingerprints are all over this situation. But first, the foundation. Christopher Blake Griffith is a musician, an entrepreneur, a young black man who, according to his own filed complaint, was inside Stefon Diggs' orbit back in the spring of 2023 when Stefon Diggs was still a Buffalo Bill and still very much in the business of curating the public version of himself. According to court documents obtained by TMZ, Christopher Blake Griffith alleges that on a specific night at Stefon Diggs' Rockville, Maryland residence, Stefon Diggs crossed a line that no professional relationship should ever approach. Christopher Blake Griffith claims Stefon Diggs drugged him. Christopher Blake Griffith says Stefon Diggs made unwanted sexual advances. Christopher Blake Griffith alleges that when he rejected those advances, the retaliation came not in the form of awkward silence but in the form of a coordinated assault. He claims Stefon Diggs dispatched a crew that included his own brother, Darez Diggs, to Christopher Blake Griffith's apartment building, where they inflicted a beating so severe that surveillance cameras captured every moment of it. That is the origin story of this entire legal saga. That is the seed that has now grown into the towering tree that Stefon Diggs is standing beneath with a chainsaw aimed at his own roots. And here is the part that a massive chunk of the internet keeps managing to overlook. Stefon Diggs is the one who filed suit first. Let that sink in. Stefon Diggs, with his money, with his brand, with a stable of attorneys on retainer, looked at his team and said, "We are not letting this stay quiet. We are not negotiating behind closed doors. We are not doing what every crisis management professional in the country would have whispered into his ear." Stefon Diggs said, "I want to sue this man for defamation." And what that decision means is that Stefon Diggs voluntarily walked himself into a discovery war. Stefon Diggs personally invited a federal judge into every corner of his private life. Stefon Diggs handed Christopher Blake Griffith a legal permission slip to demand every text message, every phone call, every travel record, every hotel invoice, every witness name, and every communication that touched this situation. And now that permission slip has been cashed. This is what my grandmother would have called self-inflicted. This is what we call teaching the fish to grease its own pan. Stefon Diggs did not get dragged into discovery kicking and screaming. He drove himself to the courthouse, opened the door, and volunteered. And now the bill is coming due. Now, hold on, because I already hear the defense squad warming up in the comments. Christopher Blake Griffith is messy. Christopher Blake Griffith has a complicated past. Christopher Blake Griffith has people in his circle who have posted entire dissertations online about the type of company he keeps. And listen, I am not out here nominating Christopher Blake Griffith for sainthood. I have seen the same posts you have seen. But if we are being honest, and this channel has never been anything other than honest, the exact same argument Stefon Diggs' supporters keep using to discredit Christopher Blake Griffith is the same argument a competent attorney will use to explain how Christopher Blake Griffith ended up inside Stefon Diggs' house in the first place. You cannot in one breath describe Christopher Blake Griffith as a connected insider, a fixer, a shadow operator who moves quietly through elite entertainment circles, and then in the next breath act stunned that a professional athlete would invite him over and try to leverage that exact dynamic. Pick a lane. And whichever lane you pick, whether Christopher Blake Griffith is the messy insider or the innocent artist, neither lane comes anywhere close to clearing Stefon Diggs of what is now sitting in that court file. So let us crack that file open. According to reporting from TMZ, which was then confirmed inside the sworn amended pleading, Christopher Blake Griffith's legal team is now in possession of text messages and phone records obtained directly through court-ordered discovery. Meaning obtained directly from Stefon Diggs' own document production. Not from a leak. Not from a burner phone. From Stefon Diggs' own files, produced by Stefon Diggs' own attorneys, in response to Stefon Diggs' own lawsuit. And those communications, according to the filing, demonstrate the coordination of the assault that Christopher Blake Griffith says he suffered. I want you to sit with that phrase. Coordination of the assault. Not a coincidence. Not a random flare-up. Not spontaneous street conflict. Coordination. As in planned. As in logistics. As in we need a flight, we need a hotel, we need to be in that city on that date. That is not what innocent people do. That is what people who are about to commit a serious crime do. And those communications, according to Christopher Blake Griffith's own filing, involve Stefon Diggs' personal assistant. The exact same personal assistant whose name has already surfaced inside another Stefon Diggs-adjacent legal matter involving a chef named Mila Adams. So the assistant is not a mystery figure. The assistant is not a stranger pulled off the street. The assistant is a witness whose testimony pattern has already been established in a courtroom. And now that same assistant's phone records are talking too. And that, folks, is the domino that Stefon Diggs' camp underestimated at their own peril. Because when the Mila Adams matter first surfaced, half the internet dismissed it as boss and employee friction. Chef says athlete assaulted her. Athlete says chef is lying. Jury says not guilty. Case closed. But the sharp observers knew right then that the assistant was something more than a bystander. The assistant is a walking spreadsheet of everything Stefon Diggs does. Who he calls. Who he pays. Who he flies. Where he stays. Who books the cars. Who handles the gifts. And when a spreadsheet like that gets subpoenaed, sweetheart, it does not lie for anybody. It does not spin. It does not go on Instagram at midnight to defend its boss. It just sits there in black and white, waiting to be printed and handed to a jury. And that is exactly where we are now. The assistant's communications are in Christopher Blake Griffith's hands. Produced by Stefon Diggs' own legal team. Which means Stefon Diggs' own lawyers handed Christopher Blake Griffith the ammunition that is now being loaded into the filing that could end Stefon Diggs' career. Buckle up, because if that alone were the extent of what Christopher Blake Griffith dropped this week, it would already be a 5-alarm fire. But it climbs higher. Christopher Blake Griffith's filing pushes the blade in another inch by claiming that the phone records show Stefon Diggs personally placed a call to one of the men who was allegedly attacking Christopher Blake Griffith at the exact minute the attack was in progress. Read that sentence again. Slowly. At the exact minute. The surveillance video Christopher Blake Griffith has already released publicly, and I am not going to replay that footage here because it is genuinely brutal and I refuse to turn a real assault into content fodder, shows one of the alleged attackers pausing mid-beating, pulling out a ringing phone, and taking the call. And according to the phone log now sitting in Christopher Blake Griffith's possession, that incoming call was placed by Stefon Diggs. That is not circumstantial. That is not a hunch. That is not an inference drawn from a fuzzy timeline. That is a phone number attached to a name attached to a timestamp attached to a video attached to a beating. That is what prosecutors call a nexus. And a nexus is the exact connective tissue that turns a civil complaint into a criminal referral. This is where a lawsuit stops being about money and starts being about whether a United States Attorney's Office opens a file. And this is where I want everybody still holding out for Stefon Diggs's version of events to slow all the way down. Stefon Diggs's entire defense from day one, in every filing, in every public statement, in every whispered leak to sympathetic outlets, has hinged on a single claim. He stole from me. That is the drum Stefon Diggs and his team have been beating for months. Christopher Blake Griffith was a thief. Christopher Blake Griffith walked off with property. Christopher Blake Griffith got what was coming to him because he took what did not belong to him. Fine. Let us pretend for one generous moment that every word of that theft story is true. Let us pretend Christopher Blake Griffith walked out of that Maryland home with a bag full of watches, chains, cash, and designer everything. Even inside that fantasy, what does a normal, law-abiding, wealthy adult with a legal team on retainer do the very next morning? He calls the police. He files a report. He hands the matter to a detective. He lets the state of Maryland do the work that taxpayers already funded. What he does not do under any circumstance is coordinate a private assault across state lines with a family member and a crew. That is not justice. That is a felony. Multiple felonies, actually, stacked on top of each other like pancakes at a Sunday brunch. And here is the hypocrisy blade that Stefon Diggs cannot pull out of his own chest. Stefon Diggs never filed a theft report. Not in Maryland. Not in New York. Not in California. Not anywhere. If Christopher Blake Griffith truly walked off with hundreds of thousands of dollars in property, as Stefon Diggs's team has repeatedly hinted, then where is the incident report? Where is the police case number? Where is the insurance claim? Where is a single shred of documentation from any law enforcement agency confirming that a theft occurred? None of it exists. Not a scrap. Not a page. Because you cannot report a theft that did not happen without committing a crime on your way out of the precinct. And Stefon Diggs's lawyers understood that from the very first meeting. Which is precisely why the theft story has always lived on social media and inside tabloid leaks and never, not one single time, inside an actual police station. That is the tell. That is the crack running down the wall. If the theft was real, it would have been reported. If it was not reported, it was not real. And if it was not real, then the entire justification for what happened to Christopher Blake Griffith evaporates like morning fog off a highway. Now let me speak to the folks who came here specifically for the celebrity crossover, because I owe you that bridge. Cardi B, bless her heart, and I mean that genuinely. Cardi B has been remarkably vocal in defending Stefon Diggs online, right up until the moment the new evidence started landing on the docket. At which point Cardi B pivoted. She redirected her energy toward other feuds, other targets. And I want to be careful here because I do have genuine respect for Cardi B. I respect her hustle. I respect her willingness to be honest about her own life in ways that most celebrities would never dare. She built an empire from nothing by saying exactly what crossed her mind the second it crossed her mind. But there is a version of loyalty that lifts a person up and there is a version of loyalty that digs the hole deeper. And Cardi B, whether she realizes it yet or not, has been operating the shovel. Because every time Cardi B jumped online to call Christopher Blake Griffith a liar, every time Cardi B told her audience the story was being twisted, every time Cardi B implied that a defamation lawsuit was proof of innocence, she was doing the exact thing that Christopher Blake Griffith's attorneys are now labeling as further defamation. That is not me being petty. That is what the amended complaint literally states. Christopher Blake Griffith is now asking the judge for permission to add a new defamation count against Stefon Diggs based on a social media post in which Stefon Diggs, without technically naming Christopher Blake Griffith, wrote that somebody was lying on his name because he got caught stealing. Stefon Diggs added that trying to act like this person is a victim because he is lying is crazy. And Christopher Blake Griffith's legal team says that post is defamatory. And guess who has been echoing that exact same messaging from her own platform? Cardi B. Now, some of you are already typing. Cardi B has every right to defend her partner. And she does. But there is a canyon of difference between saying I love him and I stand by him and going on record calling another human being a liar when you have not read a single page of the discovery file. That is not defense. That is the same broken arithmetic where somebody is convinced that 2 plus 2 equals 16 because they need the answer to look a certain way. If the numbers do not add up, the problem is not the numbers. The problem is the calculator. And right now, the calculator that Cardi B has been using does not match the receipt tape coming out of the court file. And here is the most telling thing of all. In the last 72 hours, Cardi B has gone quiet on this specific matter. She still has energy for other feuds. She still has fingers to type about other topics. But when the subject turns to Christopher Blake Griffith, when the subject turns to the amended complaint, when the subject turns to the phone log or the text messages, silence. And in the world of celebrity communications, silence is never neutral. Silence is a decision. Silence means the lawyers have entered the room. Silence means somebody sat Cardi B down and said, whatever you were about to post, do not post it, because Christopher Blake Griffith's attorneys will print it, stamp it, and file it as an exhibit. And that silence, coming from Cardi B of all people, a woman who built her entire public identity on saying whatever she thinks the instant she thinks it, is one of the loudest signals we have received yet that the people around Stefon Diggs understand exactly how damaging this evidence looks. Moving on, because the layers on this case are like an onion sitting out in summer heat. Christopher Blake Griffith's filing also references a criminal proceeding in California in which a man who shares Stefon Diggs's last name was formally charged and processed for the very same assault. That man is Darez Diggs, Stefon Diggs's brother. According to reporting from TMZ, Darez Diggs pleaded guilty to felony grand theft tied to the alleged attack. Christopher Blake Griffith had also filed a separate $10 million civil lawsuit against Darez Diggs and the apartment complex where the assault occurred, and that case has now been settled. The terms were not disclosed. But here is what matters. A member of Stefon Diggs's immediate family has already been formally processed through the criminal justice system for the same beating Christopher Blake Griffith is describing in his civil filing. That is not a small detail. That is corroboration. That is the state of California, on its own, without any prompting from Christopher Blake Griffith's civil legal team, confirming under the burden of criminal proof that a crime occurred on that date, at that location, against that victim. The only unanswered questions in the civil case now are who ordered it, who paid for it, and who benefited from it. And the phone log, that same phone log that keeps circling back into the picture like a boomerang made of evidence, appears to answer all three of those questions on a single sheet of paper. Let me hit the pattern, because this matters more than any single detail. This is not the first time Stefon Diggs's name has surfaced in a story where somebody claims to have been mistreated inside his orbit. This is not the first time we have heard the phrase "they were trying to steal from me" deployed as a blanket justification. But when the same excuse gets used across multiple incidents involving multiple people across multiple states, at some point the pattern becomes the story. At some point, either every single person Stefon Diggs encounters is a thief, which, sweetheart, is statistically laughable, or Stefon Diggs has developed a habit of reaching for the theft narrative whenever a private altercation goes sideways. Occam's razor is not being kind to Stefon Diggs on this one. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one, and the simplest explanation here is that the theft story was always a cover, always a shield, always a way to reframe a situation where Stefon Diggs was the aggressor rather than the victim. And here is where a comparison becomes unavoidable. Everybody remembers how the O.J. Simpson murder trial ended. What most people forget is how O.J.'s actual freedom ended. It ended in a Las Vegas hotel room when O.J., convinced he had a moral right to reclaim memorabilia he believed had been stolen, organized a crew, walked in, and tried to take back property by force. Nevada was not interested in his celebrity or his Heisman Trophy. Nevada looked at the coordination. Nevada looked at the participants. Nevada looked at the weapons. And Nevada dropped a sentence on O.J. Simpson that swallowed the better part of a decade of his life. Because in the United States of America, you do not get to appoint yourself judge, jury, and enforcement squad. You do not get to gather your associates, cross state lines, and go collect with your fists. That is not how the law works. And Stefon Diggs, if the evidence holds up, is walking down the exact same corridor that O.J. Simpson walked down. The same logic. The same fatal decision to trade the legal system for the street version. Now let me be very clear about something before we go any further, because I do not want anybody thinking I am running a personal campaign against Stefon Diggs. I am not. I have watched Stefon Diggs play football since his Minnesota days. I have cheered his catches. I have admired the precision of his route running. But my appreciation for what Stefon Diggs does on a football field does not obligate me to be silent when serious allegations, corroborated by a state criminal conviction, corroborated by surveillance footage, and now corroborated by Stefon Diggs' own discovery documents, are sitting in a public court file. If Stefon Diggs did what Christopher Blake Griffith says Stefon Diggs did, then Stefon Diggs deserves the full weight of a civil judgment and potentially the attention of a criminal prosecutor. And if Stefon Diggs did not do what Christopher Blake Griffith claims, then Stefon Diggs' lawyers now have the very enjoyable task of explaining the phone log, the flight records, the hotel bookings, the family conviction, and the assistant coordination texts to a jury of 12 strangers. Good luck, counselors. Let me address the folks who keep asking why Christopher Blake Griffith does not just settle. Why go through all of this? Why file amended complaints? Why chase discovery? Why publicize the surveillance video? Why endure the online attacks from Stefon Diggs' fan base, from Cardi B's fan base, from every corner of the internet that has already decided the celebrity version of events is the only version worth taking seriously? And the answer, if you actually read the pleadings instead of the tweets, is that Christopher Blake Griffith is asking for a jury trial. Not a bench trial. Not a private mediation. Not a hush agreement with a non-disclosure clause thick enough to stop a door. A jury. 12 people from the community, sitting in a box, watching the surveillance footage, hearing from the assistant, reading the phone log, and deciding in public whether Stefon Diggs did what Christopher Blake Griffith says Stefon Diggs did. That is not a man chasing a payout. That is a man chasing a verdict. When somebody wants money, they settle. When somebody wants the record to reflect what happened to them, they take it to a jury. That is the tell. And Christopher Blake Griffith has requested a jury. That request tells you everything you need to know about what this case is really about. Here is something the amateur analysts online have completely glossed over. When a plaintiff amends a complaint to add new causes of action deep into the discovery phase, it is almost always because discovery has produced material that supports those new claims. That is the diplomatic way of saying Christopher Blake Griffith found what he was looking for inside the boxes Stefon Diggs was forced to hand over. A lawyer does not go back to a judge asking permission to add a defamation count unless they have the receipts to make that count stick. So when Christopher Blake Griffith's team files an amended complaint asking to add defamation based on Stefon Diggs' own public social media post, that is lawyer language for "we caught you, we can prove it, and now we are going to make you pay for it twice. Once for the underlying assault and once for the public statements you made denying it." Let me spend a beat on that social media post because the amended complaint pivots on it. In that post, Stefon Diggs, without technically naming Christopher Blake Griffith but with context clues a child could connect, called him a liar, called him a thief, and painted himself as the victim of a shakedown. And the millisecond Stefon Diggs pressed send, Stefon Diggs handed Christopher Blake Griffith's lawyers a brand new cause of action on a silver platter. Because defamation, at its cleanest legal definition, is the publication of a false statement of fact that damages another person's reputation. And if the underlying facts break against Stefon Diggs, then every accusation inside that social media post becomes a live broadcast of false statements to millions of eyeballs. That is not a good neighborhood for Stefon Diggs. That is a district where the damages number climbs every single time somebody hits screenshot. Every share. Every retweet. Each one is a separate publication. Each one is a separate data point in a damages calculation that a jury will eventually be asked to total up. And Stefon Diggs put that post out there voluntarily. Nobody forced his hand. He chose to publish. And that choice may end up costing him more than anything that happened inside that Maryland house. Let me zoom out for a moment and talk about why this case matters beyond the specific people involved. Because Christopher Blake Griffith's allegations, if they hold up in court, describe a very particular kind of abuse of power. The kind where a wealthy, connected, publicly protected figure uses money, influence, and physical intimidation to silence a person who could damage their public image. We have seen versions of this playbook before. We saw it with a certain music mogul whose name now sits inside a federal indictment. And every time this playbook has been peeled open, the public arc has been depressingly consistent. Disbelief. Then defense. Then dismissal. Then silence. Then an eventual acknowledgement that the accuser had been telling the truth from the very first sentence. That is the arc. And Christopher Blake Griffith's case is sitting somewhere between disbelief and defense right now. But the phone log, the text messages, the coordination evidence, all of it has just shoved this story into the phase where dismissal becomes impossible. You cannot dismiss what has been sworn under oath. You cannot dismiss what has been produced through court-ordered discovery. And that is precisely why the coming weeks are going to be seismic. Once the amended complaint is officially docketed, once the discovery documents start being cited by name inside filings, once the assistant is potentially deposed under oath in this specific matter, we are going to receive a very clear picture of what Stefon Diggs actually did or did not do on that Maryland night and in the days that followed. And if that picture confirms Christopher Blake Griffith's account, Stefon Diggs's endorsements, his roster spot, his post-career broadcasting ambitions, and every inch of his public image are going to collide with a wall that no crisis PR firm on this continent has the materials to rebuild. Because sponsors, unlike fans, do not vibe with ambiguity. Sponsors read the court file. Sponsors calculate risk. Sponsors have exit clauses written into contracts. And exit clauses get triggered the very afternoon a phone log shows their client on the line with an alleged attacker during an active assault. That is corporate risk management 101. The relationship ends. Quietly. Quickly. With a press release about mutual agreement to part ways that nobody believes. Let me address one more thread from the comments because I have seen it and it deserves an honest answer. Some folks are saying, if Christopher Blake Griffith never personally walked into a police station, how serious could the allegations really be? I understand the instinct. But the reality of reporting sexual assault in this country, particularly when the accused is wealthy, connected, and publicly beloved, is that the personal cost of walking into a precinct can be catastrophic before a single detective even opens a case folder. So the fact that Christopher Blake Griffith chose the civil route first, the route that gives him control over discovery, the route that produces phone logs and text messages and travel records, is not weakness. That is strategy. And for what it is worth, Christopher Blake Griffith did file a police report. Page 6 confirmed that Griffith shared a copy of a police report on his Instagram in which he claimed Stefon Diggs drugged and sexually assaulted him on May 22, 2023, and then conspired to have him harmed. So the man did go to law enforcement. He also went to civil court. He went to both doors. And the civil door is the one that just kicked open the vault. I also want to address the framing that Christopher Blake Griffith is somehow benefiting financially from this case, because yes, civil suits do involve damages. But if you actually read the pleadings instead of the tabloid summaries, Christopher Blake Griffith told TMZ directly that he has not demanded a specific dollar amount. He scoffed at the suggestion that his case was a shakedown. He said somebody has to be responsible for what happened to him and he is ready for his day in court. The damages being sought are calibrated to the physical injuries he sustained, the psychological trauma he alleges, and the professional harm inflicted by Stefon Diggs's public statements. That is precisely what civil damages exist to remedy. To argue that Christopher Blake Griffith should not seek damages because damages exist is to argue that the entire civil docket in America is illegitimate. Nobody making that argument in good faith actually believes it. It is a deflection specifically engineered to make Christopher Blake Griffith's motives look impure so that the underlying facts get quietly ignored. Do not fall for it. So where does this leave us in a case that has already produced more twists than a soap opera writer's room? It leaves us with Stefon Diggs standing at a legal cliff, holding a defense strategy that just got liquefied by his own discovery documents. It leaves us with a celebrity partner whose loyalty is being strategically muzzled by her own legal team. It leaves us with a brother who has already been criminally processed and civilly settled in a directly related matter. It leaves us with a personal assistant whose testimony pattern is already carved in stone and whose phone records are now part of the record. It leaves us with a public that is finally beginning to notice the shape of the pattern. And it leaves us with a plaintiff, Christopher Blake Griffith, who is not asking for a settlement. Not asking for a hush deal. Not asking for a wire transfer and a non-disclosure agreement. Christopher Blake Griffith is asking for 12 strangers to sit in a public room and render a verdict. That is not a case that vanishes. That is a case that becomes a spectacle. And spectacles in the modern media era are career-ending events for any public figure whose brand depends on audience affection. I want to leave you with a thought that has been sitting with me since I first started reading through the amended complaint. Stefon Diggs on the field is one of the most gifted receivers of his generation. Off the field, Stefon Diggs is now a man accused of using violence and money to solve a problem that a single phone call to a competent lawyer could have resolved without a bruise being raised. That gap, that canyon between the Stefon Diggs the public sees on Sundays and the Stefon Diggs described inside Christopher Blake Griffith's sworn filing, is the quiet tragedy at the center of this entire story. Because if the allegations are proven, then Stefon Diggs is a man who had everything. Who conquered every level of his sport. Who was in a very public relationship with one of the biggest musicians on earth. Who had a brand and a legacy and a future. And who, according to the evidence now piling up on a public docket, threw all of it into a fire because he could not accept a single word. No. And that is what the jury, if this case reaches a jury, is going to be asked to decide. Not whether Stefon Diggs was a great football player. Not whether Christopher Blake Griffith is a flawless human being. Not whether Cardi B chose wisely in her public defense strategy. The only question a jury will be handed is whether the phone logs, the text threads, the surveillance footage, the flight records, the hotel bookings, the criminal processing of the brother, and the amended complaint filed under penalty of perjury add up to a preponderance of the evidence that Stefon Diggs did what Christopher Blake Griffith says Stefon Diggs did. And based on what has already been filed, based on what has already been reported by TMZ and confirmed inside the sworn pleadings, my honest personal read is that Stefon Diggs's lawyers are already having very tense conversations behind very closed doors about whether a jury trial is a fight Stefon Diggs can actually afford to have. So let me leave you with this. If Christopher Blake Griffith is telling the truth, we are watching the opening credits of the end of a superstar's public life. If Stefon Diggs is telling the truth, then Stefon Diggs is about to have the most explosive vindication moment in modern sports media history. Because with this level of evidence in play, there is no middle ground remaining. There is no quiet settlement that makes this disappear. There is no polite dismissal that sweeps it under a rug. Somebody is walking out of that courtroom with their reputation restored. And somebody is walking out of that courtroom in permanent ruins. And based on what Christopher Blake Griffith has already filed, based on what Stefon Diggs's own Discovery production has already coughed up, based on the phone log that keeps returning to the exact same conclusion like a compass needle pointing north, I know which side I am putting my money on. And it is not the side that handed the other side the evidence and then called them a liar on the internet. Drop your take in the comments and tell me. Do you think Stefon Diggs tries to settle this quietly now that the evidence has surfaced? Or do you think Cardi B keeps him locked inside a public fight that his own lawyers are begging him to walk away from? Tell me who you think the real strategist is in that household. Tell me if you think the silence from Cardi B is going to hold or if she is about to post something that becomes Exhibit B in the next amended complaint. Tell me honestly whether you believe a case this loud ends inside a courtroom or whether it ends behind closed doors with a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to double as a doorstop. I am reading every comment. I am pinning the sharpest takes. And I am coming right back the second the next filing hits the docket. Because with evidence this loud already in motion, the next filing is not a question of if. It is a question of when. Take care of yourselves out there. Protect your peace. And remember, inside a court of law, the only currency that matters is evidence. And Christopher Blake Griffith, whether you love him or you cannot stand him, has just deposited a full bank vault into the record. I will see you in the next one, because before the ink dries on this filing, another one is already being drafted in an office somewhere in this country. And when it lands, I will be right here to walk through it with you, receipt by receipt, phone log by phone log, and page by page until every single question in this case gets an answer. Leave a like if you made it this far, subscribe if you have not already, and I will catch you in the next one.